Last summer, I attended my first live-action roleplay, or LARP, and everything that could possibly go wrong went wrong, until I ended up crying in a flooded tent with only 100 bugs for company, while everyone else had fun playing wizards. I'd avoided LARP so far because, to be frank, I was afraid it would be cringe. But this did not happen because of cringe. This happened because of much worse things. So grab your tankard and your LARP-approved foam weapon and settle in for a horror story, because in order to show you how we got here, I need to start at the very beginning. Every year, over 1,000 people travel to Slippery Rock, Pennsylvania to spend 4 days pretending to be fantasy characters for Drachenfest US. Drachenfest invited me because, for some weird reason, they thought my followers might be interested in fantasy grown-up play pretend. No clue where they got that idea. If I agreed to come play and let you guys know about it, they would cover my entry and my travel. I try to make sure I leave my basement and touch grass at least once a year, so I figured why not do that, but with some swords in the mix. If you haven't heard of LARP, imagine that you're playing D&D, but instead of rolling dice to attack a goblin, you are actually smacking somebody dressed as a goblin with a foam sword. Depending on the game, there might be rules for things like combat or magic, but a lot of the experience comes from improvising with other players and just reacting to what happens. If D&D is telling a story about your character around a table, LARP is stepping into that story and living it. There are lots of different kinds of LARP. There's Boffer LARP, which is focused on combat, or Parlor LARP, which is smaller scale and indoors. Some LARP is fantasy, some is sci-fi, some is historical. Drachenfest US is a festival LARP. Think of it kind of like a 4-day-long Renaissance festival, but everybody camps there and roleplays as a character the whole time. It's like a big medieval fantasy sandbox. That all sounds pretty fun, right? You go play pretend for a few days, you gallivant around a fantasy-themed campground, you make new nerdy friends. But there's a reason that I've avoided LARP so far in my life, despite my clear interest in like every adjacent hobby. I'm talking, of course, about the cringe factor. To normal people, that might sound crazy, especially since I cosplay, I worked at a Renaissance festival, I'm literally a professional dungeon master. Why am I throwing all these stones from inside my extremely nerdy glass house? But inside the geek community, this is actually not an uncommon feeling.
Well, I like you, but I'm kind of scared of that guy.
I don't even know that guy.
Look at me, brother.
I'm used to playing pretend, but usually I'm doing it at a small, intimate D&D table with a handful of friends for a few hours, not in front of 1,000 strangers for 4 straight days. When I played a character at Ren Fair, that was my job. Me saying, "Good day, my lord," to some dude in a Wenches Want Me t-shirt was equivalent to a barista saying, "What can I get started for you today?" But LARP doesn't have any of that distance. I would be the character would be me. I was worried that I'd spend the entire time in a perpetual state of both firsthand and secondhand embarrassment. I'm already anxious and socially awkward. Why would I sign up for a massive social event that requires you to play wizards in front of a bunch of strangers? Now, I know we're all tired of hearing the word cringe. Especially in nerdy hobbies, I think we tend to lean more towards the "I am cringe but I am free" mindset. But even though I love that as an aspirational way to live, actually believing it is harder, especially for those of us who have been taught throughout our lives to feel shame for being weird or earnest or trying too hard. Even within the D&D community, I've been called cringe for doing things like writing fantasy music and performing it in costume. I bear the scars of cringe culture, and those take time to heal. So when I say I was afraid of LARP being cringe, I don't mean it like, ugh, those weirdos are too weird even for me. What I mean is that LARP sounded inherently vulnerable, and that terrified me. Would I be awkward? Would they be awkward? Would our mutual awkwardness combine and magnify and make every single second feel like it lasted 15 years? I didn't know. But in the end, I said yes. As an anxious person, I have to say yes to things that scare me because everything scares me. I told myself, future Ginny will handle this, and it'll make a great YouTube video, and I signed the papers. You know, sometimes past Ginny can be a real bitch. When I signed on for Drachenfest, I thought it was gonna be pretty simple. I already had characters, I already had costumes. I figured I would pick one, pack a suitcase, and show up. But it turns out LARP is not really a just show up activity. Because I was brand new, the organizers got me and the other invited creators onto some calls and gave us some LARP 101 lessons. They walked us through the rules and the structure and what to expect. I, of course, took copious notes just in case we were gonna be graded on our performance. It was unlikely, but I wasn't about to let somebody else get a gold star if one was on the table. I knew from the start that I didn't want to create a brand new character for this. I've already got too many characters, and this was a chance for one of them to finally earn their keep. I settled on Wisteria, my incompetent wizard nepo baby.
She's on this shirt.
She's an overstressed magic school student with absolutely no talent for the arcane, so when I inevitably felt nervous or did something wrong, that would be in character. My husband Josh was coming with me, so we created a character for him as well, Malachite Zoozle. Wisteria's family owns a magical cider company called Appledackle's All-Nighter Cider, and we decided the Zoozle family would be their scrappy cider-making rivals. Next, we needed to pick a camp. There are a bunch, but we ended up picking Silver Camp. It's all about nobility and truth and beauty, which is exactly what Wisteria's parents would pick for her. But we weren't actually camping in our camp, so this decision didn't really end up mattering that much. Now, Wisteria is a D&D character, so I knew that she would be a little different here. The mechanics of LARP vary from game to game, but Drachenfest's game mechanics are dramatically lighter than D&D's. There are roles, kind of like classes in D&D. For Wisteria, I chose Spellcaster, which lets you pick a few spells to learn from a list of 15. And of course, there are combat mechanics. If you fight at Drachenfest, you use LARP-safe foam weapons, which means the combat is real in the sense that you're physically swinging at each other, but the weapons are designed so nobody actually gets hurt. That's why I always carry a foam sword, so they'll let me into the LARP. But neither I nor Wisteria had any intention of getting into fights, so I admit I just skimmed that section. There are also rules for safety, like a universal phrase that ends or redirects any interaction that you're not comfortable with, and simple calls for medical emergencies. The mechanics are robust, but simple enough to remember, which is super important when you're not playing with a rulebook in arm's reach. When we talk about player safety in D&D, we're really talking about emotional and mental safety. And LARP has to deal with all of that, but also physical safety too. So far, everything we were doing felt easier than D&D. I was a little nervous that mechanics light meant social heavy because that was the part of the game I was most nervous about. But then we moved on to costuming and I started to get the inkling that I might not have realized exactly how much work I was signing up for. Wisteria already had a costume, but I knew she couldn't wear the same thing for 4 straight days, so I figured it would need to be expanded. But I quickly learned there are some key differences between the cosplay I was used to and costuming for LARP. First, and most important, wearability. I usually wear a cosplay for a few hours indoors, but at Drachenfest, I would be living in it. All day long, outside, in heat and humidity, sitting and walking and eating. My costume didn't have to just look good, it had to be practical. That meant shoes I could hike around a campground in, rain gear, and natural fibers, instead of synthetic fabrics that would put me into the medic tent with heat stroke. The next big difference, variation. Until now, Wisteria has had just one outfit, like a cartoon character. But for a multi-day LARP, I needed her clothes to cover all different kinds of scenarios. What if it rains? What if I get invited to a fancy party? What if I want to get in the water? I basically needed a wizard's capsule wardrobe. And the final difference, theme. One of the tips we learned in these LARP 101 calls is that your costuming isn't just for you, it's also for the players around you. The other players don't know anything about you or your character, but your costume can give them cues on how to interact with you. For Wisteria, her big ol' witch hat does a lot of the heavy lifting in communicating that she's a spellcaster. So I built a Pinterest board with all kinds of ambitious ideas. Normally the ace up my sleeve for highly specific costuming is that I can just make it, but I had a lot going on in the months between me and Drachenfest, so I had to pick my craft projects carefully. The most important was remaking her hat, which had grown to have the structural stability of damp cardboard in the years since I'd first made it. I also whipped up a hollow spellbook in a holster and a little capelet that could help protect me from a light drizzle. I hope my face is doing some foreshadowing for you here. It took every moment of free time I could scrape together, but Wisteria did end up with a wardrobe. But while I had some existing costuming to work with, Josh was starting from zero. He had like one pirate shirt and some Ren Fair hand-me-downs from my family. We ordered some basics, but when Josh did his first try-on, it was not promising. He looked like medieval background extra number 4. I know this is a little on the nose, but the best way to describe it is that it had no character. But after dabbling in the dark and forbidden school of accessorization, he finally started to look like the kind of character who would have a last name. But I had one more plan for these costumes that would make sure we didn't look like background extras, and it was also my anti-cringe secret weapon. This would arm us against the awkwardness that I knew I would feel the minute I was surrounded by strangers and trying to convince myself to talk to them. I mentioned earlier that Wisteria and Malachite are from rival cider dynasties, and what better way to figure out whose cider is best once and for all than offering samples? It was the perfect icebreaker. The vision in my head was very much the classic fantasy merchant with a ridiculous backpack. So I brought home a truly unhinged thrift store haul and got to work making cider dispensing backpacks. I bought some clear plastic containers and installed spigots myself, and when I tested them, they seemed to be watertight. in the way that a room seems to be empty when you roll a 6 on perception. More on that later. I matched the designs to our respective aesthetics, so Wisteria's was polished and neat, all white and blue and silver, while Malachite's was more rustic and homemade looking. Now we just had to decide what to fill them with. Josh and I picked up a bunch of ingredients that we felt confident we could find at any given grocery store in Pennsylvania. Then we set to work crafting our family cider recipes. With the characters created, the costumes done, and the props packed up in bubble wrap, it was time to head to Pennsylvania. I remember thinking, thank goodness, the hard part is over. I have armored myself against cringe with a canonically anxious character, an emotional support husband, and a built-in interactive prop to break the ice. Now all I have to do is flounce around in a wizard hat for a few days. But I was about to learn the kinds of lessons they don't teach you in wizard school. And we hadn't even seen the weather forecast yet.
You got me so bad, you make it all slow down, not getting closer, you're killing me.
The travel itself went very smoothly, which in hindsight should have been my first warning sign. When you successfully transport 2 homemade cider dispensers, 3 suitcases full of costuming, and a giant wizard hat across the country without incident, the universe is probably looking for another way to humble you. When we arrived at Cooper's Lake Campground, the first thing that struck me was just how enormous the grounds were. Drachenfest isn't taking place in one neat little festival square. It's spread across a huge campground. There are camps tucked into the woods, winding paths, a lake and a river, a massive battlefield with a permanent battlement structure, and a giant bazaar area full of shops. And even while people were still arriving and setting up, it was packed. Josh and I were staying in a little collection of tents in an out-of-game area called the Glade. This is where staff and invited creators stayed. These big medieval-style canvas tents are very common in LARP, and I completely understand why. Visually, they are incredibly immersive. Some players decorate them with rugs and furniture and decor, all the kinds of things that make it feel like your character actually lives there. I saw some genuinely gorgeous tent setups around the event, both in the bazaar and inside the camps. But I do need you to understand something about these tents. There is no floor. The floor is just the grass underneath the tent. And unlike a modern camping tent, the canvas doesn't seal. There are no zippers or screens, which means that the local wildlife has fairly open access to your living space. And the local wildlife, it turns out, was very interested in dropping by. If you don't like hearing about bugs, this might not be the video for you, and you should definitely stay out of Slippery Rock, Pennsylvania. There are no images or videos of bugs, but I'm gonna talk about them. Oh, I'm gonna talk about them. If you are unfamiliar with earwigs, they are a bug that is pretty much harmless, but does not look like it. I know that inside their little bug hearts, they are not much different from ladybugs. So maybe I'm a bigot. A bug bigot. A bugget. But I just can't help but hate them, and Pennsylvania apparently has all of them. I'm from Colorado, where bugs exist in what I would describe as a much more reasonable quantity. You might see one occasionally and think, oh, a bug. Good day, sir. But things are different in Pennsylvania. The first time we opened the flap of our tent, there were probably 20 of them hanging out just clustered under that flap. It was like checking into a hotel room and there's already somebody lying on the bed. And that somebody is Gregor Samsa. Earwigs love dark, enclosed spaces, which means hanging towels, shoes, blankets, basically all the things you would prefer not to contain bugs. I'm somebody who used to have recurring nightmares as a child that I would wake up in my bed and find it completely covered in ants. I would have to get out of bed and turn on the lights and pull back the blankets to make sure there were no bugs before I could go back to sleep. And those nightmares were about to come to very literal life, except the ants in my bed were 10 times bigger and had scary pinchers on their face. This was just a rough start because immediately all the hopeful images in my head of sitting around a fire, making in-character besties and drinking mead were replaced by this panicked voice in my head going bugs, 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 oh my god, bugs, bugs everywhere, and drowning out all of the whimsy. And then there were the facilities. Look, I camp. I am not precious about camping. I have camped with no access to plumbing, so I am not the type to look a gift campground shower in the faucet. But when you have over 1,000 people sharing the same facilities, things get gross. They just do. It's nobody's fault, it's just a matter of scale. Plus, the water itself had so much iron in it that it was literally red. So you would dry yourself off after a shower and your white towel would look like a crime scene. The thing that should have been a cooling, relaxing retreat that gave you a chance to reset and feel like a human just became another gauntlet you had to steel yourself for. But the bugs and the showers were only the beginning because the real enemy of Drachenfest 2025 turned out to be the weather. Now, the organizers had warned warned us that it would be hot and humid, and I believed them. I did guest cast at a Texas Renaissance Festival one summer. This is not my first rodeo, but it's like my second rodeo, which is not quite enough rodeos to call yourself a cowgirl. The grounds are huge, which means getting anywhere involves a lot of walking, and at least half the grounds are in direct sunlight. Our tent was also mostly in direct sunlight, so it's not like we could really retreat there to recover. The options were basically hot outside or hot inside.
I'm so sweaty. It is hot. It's hot as balls. Don't LARP in a wig, kids.
And then the rain started. Lots of people have said that having crazy weather during a LARP is a staple of the genre, so at least I was getting an authentic experience, because on the first night of the game, right as we were getting ready for the opening ceremony, the sky absolutely opened up. Josh and I had literally just finished getting into costume when the wind started pulling on the tent, and then rain started coming in along the seams. We ran to tie the door shut, and I noticed that the front panels of the tent were pulling loose from the poles that hold the entire thing up. I put on my Brave Girl pants, and I reached up past the earwigs to try and hook them back into place, and that was the exact moment when the back half of the tent just collapsed on us. The roof came down on top of us, the clothing rack fell on top of me, and within seconds, torrential rain had completely soaked both of our beds and our open suitcases. Remember, this was the first day. Once the tent had collapsed, there was really no reason to stay inside because we were getting just as wet as we would have outside, so we crawled out into the rain and started hauling on the poles trying to get it upright again with the help of some of our tent neighbors. At this point, my YouTuber instincts finally kicked in and I yelled to Josh to film it, so there is footage of me in full wizard costume being absolutely pelted by rain while we attempt to reconstruct a medieval tent in the middle of a thunderstorm. And we were actually lucky. Tents collapsed all over the campsite that day. A tree limb apparently fell on one tent with someone inside. One guy came back from the showers to discover that his entire tent had blown away and everything he owned was soaking wet and scattered across the campsite. The sheer volume of rain left the ground soaked, and some of the camps that were on lower ground were actually flooded, like inches of standing water across the whole camp. This happened mere hours before the opening ceremony. The game hadn't even started yet, and now we weren't sure when it would. Because when something like this happens, the game stops and it's all about safety, making sure everyone is okay, assessing the damage, and only then making decisions about what's next. We managed to get the tent standing again, but everything inside was soaked. The ground underneath had turned into mud, all of our clothes and shoes and bedding were drenched, and if I'm honest, from that point on, the tent never really felt safe to me again. Instead of a place that I could retreat when I needed a minute, it was a place that was soaking wet, full of bugs, and could collapse on top of me at any time. I have to say, this mattered to me a lot more than I expected, because when you're doing something that already feels vulnerable, like LARPing for the first time, you need somewhere you can go to and reset. And before we even started, I felt like I lost that. And I cannot emphasize enough that this was no one's fault. In fact, the organizers very kindly put us up, along with the other creators who were camping in the glade, in a nearby hotel that night. We got to dry our clothes in the hotel dryer and sleep in a dry bed with absolutely zero bugs in it, and then come back the next morning refreshed and ready. I honestly was just gonna do that out of pocket, but I very much appreciate that they did it for us. When we got back to the grounds, I was fully expecting to return to a half-packed camp. I wasn't even sure I should be in costume because I assumed that a lot of people were just packing up and leaving, but I was wrong. I returned to find a fully functional medieval town, full of people who were already operating at 110%. They had come to play pretend, and they were gonna play goddamned pretend, come hell or like super high water. They were totally gung-ho. They were hosting parties in the swamp camps. And much like the earwig-borne malaria that I had no doubt contracted, it was infectious. Yes, I know earwigs aren't known to carry any diseases, nor are they venomous. I know they're innocent, but they're so gross. So rain or not, it was game on, which meant it was time to bring out the cider backpacks for our first sampling. As a social icebreaker, this worked perfectly. When people heard us calling out free samples and saw the backpacks, they immediately understood the bit. We even leveled it up the following day by hiring somebody from the bazaar to follow us around, ringing a big bell and yelling free samples. They'd come over to try the cider, and then Josh and I would start loudly talking trash about each other's product, while the poor player caught in the middle had to decide which fictional cider dynasty they were going to give their allegiance to. In theory, they were supposed to judge based on taste, but if we're being honest, both of the ciders were basically apple juice with a few extra ingredients thrown in. The real deciding factor was whichever story they found more entertaining. Now, you're probably saying, Ginny, I wish I could have been there to sample these ciders and cast my own vote. And today must be your lucky day, friend, because Wisteria and Malachite have offered to give you a little cider tutorial, so you can mix up these two proprietary recipes at home and decide for yourself.
Hi everybody, I'm Wisteria Skitterquick Appletackle.
And I'm Malachite Zoozle.
And we're gonna teach you our proprietary cider recipes.
Proprietary. You cannot steal these or sell them.
You're not allowed to use these for any commercial purposes, or the Appletackle family lawyers will come after you. We'll start with Appletackle's All-Nighter Cider, the #1 magical energy cider in the world.
Number 2.
#1 in sales. We start with 1 part apple juice. Here at Appletackles, we fresh squeeze our apple juice, but I'm using this kind so that you know you can make it at home. 1 part ginger ale. Ah! A splash of lemon juice, and a cinnamon stick or two for that cozy feeling of home. And that's Appletackles All-Nighter Cider. Do you want to show us your product?
Zoozle Zip and Zing, I absolutely do. The #1 cider in everyone's hearts and minds. So we start with 1 part apple juice.
Sounds really similar.
It is.
Almost like it's a ripoff.
Yeah, it's almost like you ripped off our recipe.
We've been cooking our recipe for hundreds of years.
After that, we do 1 part club soda. This isn't club soda, this is mineral water. You can also use mineral water. I prefer it. It's less sugary. It gives you less of a headache.
You heard it here first, folks. Zoozle Zip and Zing gives you a headache.
Anyway, we put a little bit of zazz in there.
That's a lot of zazz.
Oh, it is a lot of zazz. More zazz than you put in yours because mine is zazzier. Some grenadine, just a little splash because grenadine is very, very sweet. And here it is, Zoozle Zip and Zing. Here we go. Cheers.
May the best cider win.
Yeah.
Which is ours, it's our cider.
Wow, such a treat that they took time away from their busy schedule doing important gnome things in order to share this with us. Unfortunately, the backpacks did have one small design flaw. When I tested them at home, the containers seemed perfectly watertight, but after a while walking around in the heat, we both started to notice a suspiciously sticky sensation on our lower backs. Now, to be fair, this did make us smell amazing. If you had walked past us at that moment, you would have thought, wow, those merchants smell delightfully autumnal. But it did mean that after a couple of sampling sessions, we became a little more conservative about how often we brought the backpacks out. Between the heat, the humidity, and the possibility of accidentally turning ourselves into the tastiest apple cinnamon snack an earwig could ask for, there was a limit to how long we wanted to wear them. Even with the cider backpacks breaking the ice, I could feel myself holding back from the kind of full character immersion that LARP is supposed to be about. I had accidentally put myself into the role of something like an NPC, and whenever somebody offered me a chance to turn our brief interaction into something bigger, I pulled back. Handing out samples and bantering for a minute or two was easy, but digging into Wisteria's story and connecting it with others felt a lot bigger and scarier. Thankfully, there were tons of other ways to interact with the game, so I set off to try them. The core premise of the event is that each camp follows a different dragon. Those dragons can take the form of human avatars, who are the only NPCs in the game. Players hunt for dragon eggs, which are basically points for your camp. They can also be stolen, which means camps are constantly sieging each other. At the end of the event, there's a huge battle for even more eggs, and whichever camp ends up with the most points determines which dragon rules for the next year. But there's also a ton of gameplay that is totally player-driven. There's a quest board where anyone can post notices or jobs. There's the bazaar, which is full of people who aren't attached to camps and instead run fantasy businesses. Some of them are real vendors where you can buy things with real money, but a lot of them operate entirely on in-game currency. There's even a group of players running a daily newspaper that actually reports on the things happening at the LARP. At one point, we managed to get ourselves into a fancy masquerade ball at another camp.
We are headed to the Mask of Shadows. We got an invitation.
We did. We only had to give them our souls.
We didn't give them our souls, but they did tell us that they could strip all of the flesh off our bones so that we wouldn't be hot anymore because our skeletons would be more breathable, and we considered it.
That actually sounded like a good deal.
Their whole space was decorated, there was live music, and people from all the different camps were mingling together. During that party, one of my friends had an assignment from some shadowy underground guild to poison someone. Now, she was understandably hesitant to poison someone who didn't know they were about to be poisoned, so she went around the party until she found someone willing to volunteer, which is how I ended up witnessing what I can only describe as a consensual poisoning. He drank the poison, collapsed to the ground dramatically, and began writhing in agony while she asked him questions like, "Do you feel nausea? How would you rate your abdominal pain on a scale from 1 to 10? Eventually, she gave him the antidote and he recovered. An educational experience for all who were present, honestly, but also an interaction that I just watched. Everyone around me was playing and participating, but every time I opened my mouth and tried to join in, I felt like I wasn't doing it right, and I would just fall silent again. There was this battle raging inside of me because I knew that the whole point of being here was to take a risk and try something new, but the more hours and days passed with me acting as a silent observer, the easier it got to just stay there. If I didn't do anything, then how could I screw it up? I figured what I really needed was some structure. I had learned that I wasn't brave enough to jump in and make my own play, or at least not right off the bat. So instead, I would just lean on the more official parts of the game and see if that felt easier to get into. Drachenfest has a bunch of guilds where you can take classes to gain or level up different skills. And I mean skills on your character sheet. If you come back to Drachenfest year after year, you can level up your guild skills and get better and better at the ones you've chosen. These classes are both immersive and meta. You are learning in character, but what's being taught is how to roleplay that skill. So in the alchemy class, you're learning about how to make different potions and their effects, but you're also learning about special effects like fog and flash paper. Alchemy felt like a good fit for Wisteria, so we got on the list and showed up in the morning ready to learn about potion making.
So I was supposed to be at potion making 1. I ran back to close our tent door because it started thundering, and then I was told to shelter in place because of lightning. So I guess I won't get to learn potions.
At this point, the organizers were understandably being very cautious about the weather. So when it started raining heavily, we were told to shelter in place, which meant I couldn't leave the tent to get back to the class. So Josh got to do the alchemy lesson, while I sat in the tent, listening to the rain, with the bugs. This was a constant throughout the event. Things would be happening, we'd be LARPing away, and then suddenly the clouds would split open and everything would pause while we waited for it to stop raining. I remember at least 3 or 4 times that sudden rainstorms stopped gameplay in its tracks, sometimes for an hour or more.
It's raining again.
Once you factor in the heat, the storms, eating, showering, getting into costume, mixing up cider samples, dropping off the cider sample backpacks at the tent and changing out of your apple juice clothes, and occasionally sitting down for 5 minutes to remember that you are, in fact, an introvert, 4 days can go by shockingly fast. Sitting in that tent, missing my alchemy class, and feeling the final hours ticking away, I couldn't help but feel like everyone around me was deep in their stories, and I hadn't even started mine. Sheltering in place in the tent, I found myself thinking not just about missing the alchemy lesson, but all the other parts of the game that I had missed by being afraid of feeling uncomfortable or looking stupid. To some of you, this is going to sound insane, and I am honestly so happy for those of you who have never experienced this, but my fellow high anxiety pals will undoubtedly be familiar with that moment when you realize you've been letting your anxiety stop you, and now it's too late to start. The opportunity has already passed. The thing you could have done, the moment you could have stepped into, it's over. And suddenly you're sitting there realizing that the only thing in your way was your own brain. I have done this to myself so many times throughout my life. It feels like this prison that I built for myself and then locked myself into. And the most painful part is that when you look back on it, you can't even figure out why it felt so impossible. It is very easy to beat yourself up in those moments. I'm an easy crier, so of course I was bawling in the tent, thinking back on how simple it should have been. Just talk to people, just try something, just take a risk. But instead, I had spent 3 days trying to avoid feeling awkward. And in doing so, I had accidentally avoided the experience I came here to have. Anxiety can lock you out of meaningful experiences in ways that feel so pointless. Logically, you know that there isn't any real risk. It's not gonna hurt you to feel awkward. It's not gonna hurt you to say something a little stupid. The worst case scenario is so low stakes. But ultimately, anxiety is your brain trying to protect you. Somewhere along the line, I learned that vulnerability was dangerous. And so my mind is constantly trying to steer me away from those situations where I feel vulnerable. My anxiety is a well-meaning but deeply unqualified life coach. So I hold back, I stay safely on the sidelines, and before you know it, the moment is gone. And I know that for viewers who don't experience this, it must be so frustrating to hear me talk about doing this to myself. But trust me, it is infinitely more frustrating inside my own head. It wasn't until I'd gotten my tears and my frustration out that I finally had the clarity to realize something. Everyone here knows this is awkward. Every single person at Drachenfest understands that pretending to be a wizard in the woods of Pennsylvania is a little bit objectively ridiculous. My fellow LARPers were not magically born cringe-free. They're not unaware that their hobby is a little weird. They're just willing to put aside that fear and that self-consciousness in order to experience something exciting and unique and personal. They had all made the same decision. The awkwardness didn't matter. It was an obstacle to fun. My fear of being cringe wasn't protecting me from a bad experience, it was the thing ruining my experience. And the solution wasn't heading it off by playing an anxious character or creating the perfect icebreaker backpack. There was no amount of planning or strategy that would remove cringe from the equation. The solution wasn't eliminating it, it was doing what everyone else had already done and just accepting it. If I had come into day one saying, man, this is gonna be awkward, and that's okay. Let's get in there and start being awkward so I can get used to it and move on with my life. I can only imagine how different my experience would have been. During those LARP 101 lessons, the event organizers told me about these concepts in LARP called the if and the click. The if is the distance between you and your character, and the click is when you and your character are one. You are in a flow state. You're not consciously thinking about being in character, you're just feeling it. The technique is simple. You shorten the if to get to the click. The smaller the distance between you and your character, the easier it is to enter that flow state. And nobody was pretending that this is easy. In fact, they told me that the first hour of LARP is the most painful because everybody is stuck in that if. But the more people around you are clicked, the easier it is for you to click. For the whole event so far, my if had been vast. There was a canyon between me and Wisteria, and I had been too scared to try and cross it, so I was stuck in that painful first stage. Not for an hour, but for 3 whole days. And as the rain finally stopped and I emerged from my group therapy session with the earwigs, I decided I was gonna try and get as far across that canyon as I could with the time I had left. Because the craziest part was, no matter how hesitant I was, people just kept reaching out their hands to me. Everyone I met was ready to invite me into the story. All I had to do was say yes. That night, we visited a tavern in the Red Camp. It was player run, and they were serving mead that they had actually brewed themselves at home and brought along to sell for in-game currency. I'm not even usually a mead person, to be honest, but it was really good. There were a few small tables, and there was a bard there as well, a player with a guitar and a little in-character book full of songs. He was clearly just like a very good musician in real life, and it added so much to the atmosphere. I wasn't doing any real role-playing in that moment, but I remember noticing that I felt more immersed than I had anywhere else during the event. Sitting there with a tankard of homemade mead, lit by these glowing lanterns, listening to this bard play music while people chatted around us, it genuinely felt like being inside a medieval tavern scene. And then the Red Dragon Avatar entered the tavern. He had one of the Red Camp warriors with him, and in this big booming voice, he told everyone the story of how that warrior had defended the camp gates while the rest of Red's fighters were away sieging another camp. One by one, this warrior had dueled the attackers who came to the gate, holding them off as long as he could before finally falling in battle. Now, obviously, this was a game. No one had actually died, and when a character dies at Drachenfest, they go to a special in-game area called Limbus, and they can still return to the game. But when the Avatar called on the camp to honor him before he left for Limbus, the entire tavern just erupted. Everybody was cheering and yelling, celebrating this player for defending their camp. He got an honest-to-God hero's send-off from his comrades, and it might sound a little silly to say, but it was genuinely so moving. Eventually, the night wound down, and we left the tavern to start the long walk back through the dark woods towards our camp. And that's when we were set upon by bandits. They stepped out onto the path in full armor and asked us where we were going in a tone that made it very clear this was not a friendly travel inquiry. Even though I knew it was a game, I felt this very real spike of fear, and that was actually the coolest part because I knew I was safe. If the interaction ever crossed a line, I could just use the safety phrase and everything would stop, which meant I could safely embrace the tension of the scene instead of avoiding it. I think this was the first moment when I felt like I had found it. I had clicked. The experience I was having and the experience Wisteria was having were the same. I was feeling what she was feeling. I was in it. They asked what we could offer them to make it worth their while to make sure we reached our destination safely. I tried asking if they might help us out of the kindness of their hearts, which earned me a very theatrical villain laugh, so I dug into my coin purse and handed over a few coins. Once they'd been paid off, they were actually super helpful. We weren't completely sure about the direction we were headed, and they gave us very clear directions on which way to go, from muggers to tour guides in 60 seconds. As we walked away, I just felt so exhilarated by this tiny little moment. It was probably 3 minutes start to finish, but for those 3 minutes, I wasn't worried about whether or not I was doing it right. I was just in the moment, reacting naturally, experiencing the scene. I felt like I finally got it. I understood why people get addicted to this. I'm not gonna claim that after this epiphany, I magically found the click and was fully immersed for the rest of the game. That night didn't transform me into the world's best LARPer, but from that point on, I felt like I was finally participating instead of spectating. One of the big things this experience taught me is that this type of roleplay is a skill, and it's a skill that I have not built yet. I was not prepared for how much LARP demands of you. Calling it playing pretend makes it sound simple, but learning to see past what's actually happening in the real world and into the shared fantasy of everyone around you is not easy. Nobody at a LARP is under the impression that they look like they're in Lord of the Rings or something. But that's why we're pretending. We're using our imaginations. This isn't a movie set. None of us will ever be Aragorn. But if you want to imagine that you're Aragorn, it helps when the people around you affirm you and treat you like Aragorn. Everyone needs to work together to bridge the gap between what's happening and what we're imagining happening. The bandits helped me feel the fear of being mugged. And by reacting with fear, I helped the bandits feel like muggers, when really we're just a bunch of nerds wearing costumes at a campground. But in that moment, we each played our parts, and we were each rewarded by getting to live that experience. You know, when I announced that I was going to Drachenfest US and that it would be my first LARP, a lot of people told me that was a bad idea. They said a festival LARP like this was too big for a first experience, and encouraged me to seek out something smaller to get my feet wet. Now, I don't know if I think this is a universal truth or anything. I think there are a lot of people who could probably show up at an event like Drachenfest US for their first LARP and have a wonderful time. But for me, I do think the size of the event was an attractive safety net. I thought going big would be less awkward because amongst 1,000 people, it's easy to hide. Once I started to open up, it got easier and it got more fun. But it took me so long to get there, I barely had any time to explore that part. Instead, by the end of the event, I just had so many ideas about what I would do differently next time. Drachenfest is incredibly open-ended. There are quests and guild classes and big battles, but for the most part, the game doesn't come find you. You have to go find the game. Coming from tabletop role-playing, that was a big adjustment. In D&D, there's always a dungeon master there to guide the story forward, presenting problems, framing scenes, making sure the spotlight moves around the table. Even when the game is sandboxy, there's still structure in place to nudge the players towards the next thing. But a festival LARP like this didn't have that same structure. There's no DM telling you what scene you're in or what your next objective should be. And if you're someone like me whose default instinct is to hesitate and overthink, that freedom can be intimidating. Another thing I realized is just how important the camps are to the social life of the game. Even though I was technically part of Silver Camp, I didn't spend much time there. Silver was actually the camp that was physically furthest from the glade, where Josh and I actually had our tent. That meant I missed out on a lot of the natural momentum and bonding that happens when you're constantly returning to the same group of people throughout the day. If I ever do this again, even if I'm not physically sleeping in a camp, I would absolutely treat mine as my home base, because that's where the heartbeat of the game seems to live. Realizing all of this was great, but it was also a little frustrating because I had figured it out at the very end. By the time I really started to understand how to approach the game, it was pretty much over. Which means now, instead of feeling intimidated by LARP, I feel something much worse. I want to try it again. So, after all that, I guess we should come back to the original question. is LARP cringe? When I first started thinking about going to Drachenfest, I thought the answer would be yes, and that scared me, because when you spend enough time on the internet, it's very easy to start believing that the worst thing you could possibly do is to be earnest, to do something as silly as playing pretend, and not have the decency to cloak it behind layers of irony and sarcasm like everybody else. But over the course of this experience, my answer changed several times. First, it became, yes, it's cringe, and that's fine. Of course it's a little silly to dress up as a wizard and pretend to sell magical cider out of a backpack. That is a little cringe. But by the end of the event, my answer had changed again. Because once you actually see what people are building together, the stories, the characters, the little moments of shared imagination, that question kind of just stops making sense. You reach a point where you hear, is LARP cringe? And the only meaningful answer is, who cares? Why are you still harping on that question when you could just be playing? My biggest mistake was centering my fear of what others would think of me, instead of centering my chance to play the coolest, most intense, most immersive fantasy game you can imagine. Even with the bugs and the storms and the flooded tent, I got a taste of that click, and it's hard to not want to chase it down again. Unfortunately, I won't be able to make it back to Drachenfest US this year because I'll actually be at GameCon Canada that same week, but if you're watching this and thinking that this looks like fun, you can head over to drachenfest.us to learn more and buy tickets. Prices go up at the beginning of April, so if you're considering it, now would be a very good time to decide. You can use the code DFGinnyD to get 5% off. Also, when we got home from Pennsylvania, we discovered we had accidentally brought 3 earwigs back with us in our suitcases. So if you see 3 very confused earwigs wandering around Colorado, wondering where all the other bugs are, be kind to them. They've been through a lot.